My next story is really the kind of recurring theme of my news feed has been these different climate protests, big, large, and small. So last week there was the so-called Day of Action student climate protests, or students striking from school, and as many as 4 million people around the globe took place in these climate protests, though that number is almost certainly an exaggeration, but it was uh, it seems very reasonable to say that it was at least in the millions. And one interesting thing to ask is, well, what exactly were they protesting? Now, a lot of the so-called protesters just skipped school because they wanted to skip school, and lots of schools, gave them permission to skip. So, it's not too much of a strike if you get permission from the organization you're striking from. But in any case, a lot of the different protests would have some concrete proposal that was insane and impossible, like switching entirely to wind and solar by 2030. But many of the organizers, so I'm going to quote from the Global Climate Strike website, were explicitly and radically anti-capitalist. And so the Global Climate Strike website was calling for using the climate emergency to pursue an agenda of, quote, equity, reparations, and climate justice. And if you want to dig in a little bit to some of the specifics in terms of what does that even mean, here's just a few of the demands. So the first one is keep fossil fuels in the ground. So in other words, mass death. Then it's reject what they call false solutions that are displacing real people-first solutions to the climate crisis, which includes geoengineering, carbon capture, and, quote, other techno fixes, as well as biofuels. So it's, not just mass death, but make that mass death inevitably worse and take away any, hope of reducing emissions in a way that doesn't lead to mass death. And then they say advance real solutions that are just, feasible, and essential, transform energy systems away from corporate-controlled fossil fuels and other harmful sources such as nuclear, mega hydro, and biofuels to a clean, safe system that empowers people and communities. All right, so now we've gotten rid of nuclear and hydro as well. So this is basically an outright energy starvation thing, and there's a bunch of other stuff that incorporates every kind of anti-capitalist buzzword and cause you might imagine. So, on the one hand, we have this really evil nihilistic agenda that wants to tear down freedom, industry, business, capitalism, economic growth. And that would be bad enough if it was just advocating really bad ideas. But it's actually worse, because as bad as their agenda is, they would have a right to advocate it. But now they're actually increasingly resorting to criminal activity to promote their ideas. So, we've talked about Extinction Rebellion in the UK and other parts of the globe. Well, the latest thing that here's just a few stories that I saw recently. So one is you had some climate protesters who were going to try to use drones to bring flights to a halt in Heathrow Airport in UK. And thankfully this didn't happen and they were arrested. But you can see how besides bringing flights to a halt, flying drones into flight airspace is probably a really bad idea. Yesterday, on Monday, in Washington, D.C., a bunch of climate protesters actively shut down traffic throughout the city. And as many people have pointed out, this really didn't harm the people that they said they wanted to harm. If you're a hydrocarbon executive or any of these kind of like DC insiders, it's not a big deal to work from home or get to the office a little bit late, but if you are paid by the hour making minimum wage, then that could be catastrophic. But no, they are going to deprive people of their right to use fossil fuels, and they're going to deprive people of their right even to get to work. And here's an example that actually was good and I'd like to see more of. Not what the protesters did, but the response, which is in Houston, climate change protesters shut down the largest U.S. energy export port for a day by dangling from a bridge. And I mentioned a few weeks ago a new law in Texas where it was a felony to disrupt energy pipelines and ports. Well, 31 of those protesters now face up to $10,000 fine and 2 years in prison if convicted of these felonies. And the government's considering, Texas government, and I think the federal government as well, are considering even more charges. One thing I want to stress about this, I think in all of these cases, these are criminal actions, and they should be treated as criminal actions, and organizations that advocate and plan these actions should be treated as criminal organizations. And I say that as somebody who is an uncompromising 100% supporter of free speech without exceptions. The key issue is that actions like this are not speech. When you use compulsion, when you stop people from physically moving to work or to home or wherever they're going about their business, when you stop businesses from being able to engage in legal activities by interfering with their ability to transport the energy that we need, when you fly into airspace and stop flights, let alone risk even hurting or killing people, these are all actions. And your right to communicate ideas, that just protects your ability to persuade. It doesn't give you license to use force. Like, you can't just go around and basically say something that would be criminal if I just did it for kicks. Well, I have an ideological reason, so that's my freedom of expression. No, your freedom of expression protects your ability to communicate ideas, not to engage in compulsion against people. And so I think, Texas is taking a really hard line against this, and they should, because these are just trial balloons. And the more that these protesters can get away with it and they get a slap on the wrist, the more we're going to see of it. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out where that ends up over time. Steffen, I don't know what's the situation in Germany. What was the state of the protests last weekend, and have you seen any of these kind of actual kind of criminal sorts of protests in your neighborhood?
Yeah, so there were in the usual larger cities, there were some protests. I think Germany is a leader in that, in the European context at least. And there was also something like traffic blocking and things like that going on. And what I noticed, at least on social media, in the German social media realm, a lot of politicians attacked the police that did something against the protesters that were actively, as you said, exercising force and violence against others by blocking traffic and things like that. And it's probably a much bigger problem than in the United States. There's certainly nobody debating increasing the criminal justice code to get this kind of punishment. And one of the big issues in Germany is the de-escalation by the justice system. It's not just a problem with the climate protests, it's also a problem with like Antifa, rioting in the streets and this kind of thing. So this is really, I think one needs to take a hard line where force of this kind is involved. And I think you're absolutely right that, de-escalation tactics and not punishing people who offended, did these offenses, not punishing them is just encouraging them. And so you have to see that their narrative amongst themselves is, okay, this is the issue of our lifetime. This is a moral issue. We are essentially fighting our Hitler of our generation, and the gloves come off and everything goes. And I think an intellectual society ruled by laws should fight that decisively and make clear this is, here's a rule of law, and there's a difference between, forcing your way and arguing your way, and you can't cross that line. I think that's quite important. And I think the German governments of various levels are failing in this regard.